off in our number 10 spot, we have the heads up. I'm not sure why, but for actual years, I thought that on the day of the Titanic sinking, the iceberg they hit just kind of came out of nowhere and surprised them, so imagine my surprise when I found out that wasn't true even in the slightest. It turns out the entire thing could have been avoided. The crew had received 6 warnings about the iceberg before the collision. While the first few warnings were received by the captain, not all of them were, and it's not totally clear why. Although the crew knew about the icy conditions on the water, they didn't slow down much, which some have called a reckless decision, but apparently this was standard practice at the time, so I suppose you can't really blame them. The final warning, however, was received from a ship that had halted for the night due to an ice field a few miles away, and when the message was being relayed to the captain, he cut it off and said to shut up as he was working Cape Race. In our number 9 spot today, we have the futility. This is more so something that happened prior to the fateful day of the Titanic sinking, but it's still quite unsettling and also kind of bizarre nonetheless. In 1898, a book called Futility was released by an author named Morgan Robertson. This book tells the story of a large ship named the Titan. The Titan sets out for its first sail but encounters and strikes an iceberg. This certainly sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? Considering this book was released in 1898 and the real-life event of the Titanic sinking happened in 1912, there are many people who believe that this novel predicted this fateful day. It's most likely a very strange coincidence, but man is it really weird. Even with the names being so close, let alone how the rest of the story just matches up so well. Maybe Morgan Robertson is a time traveler or some kind of prophet, but if he was to guess, it would be kind of rude to just write a book about it rather than, I don't know, warn someone? In our number 8 spot today, we have True Love. 2 of the first class passengers who were on the ship were elderly couple Isidore and Ida Stratus. When the ship started to sink and lifeboats were being boarded, attendants were ushering Ida into one of the lifeboats, but of course without her husband, since women and children were being rescued first. Ida, however, refused to leave her husband, and Isidore refused to be rescued before other men. Instead, they both chose to stay on the ship and they went down together. Ida said, quote, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die. Together." Survivors who witnessed their love last saw the pair standing on the deck with their arms around each other. This love story is incredibly tragic, but also just such a testament to how much they loved each other. I am very glad that they had one another in those very frightening moments. In our number 7 spot today, we have Take My Spot. John Jacob Astor was one of the first class passengers on the ship that day. As the ship was sinking, he put his young wife on one of the lifeboats and he was about to get in with her when he saw 2 absolutely terrified children standing behind him. He instead gave up his spot and let those 2 children on the boat, which is both noble, but it's also just the right thing to do. One of the Titanic survivors named Philip Mock saw John in one of his final moments. He saw him and his valet huddled together on one of the life rafts before they unfortunately froze in the cold water. This was indeed a very tragic event, but the positive news is that both his wife and the child she was carrying at the time were able to make it to safety and survive the whole ordeal, which also likely means that the children he gave his spot up for also survived. While there are many terrible stories from this day, we also hear quite a few about the bravery people showed during this tragic event. In our number 6 spot today, we have the lifeboat. Before the Titanic set sail during the preparation for the journey, at some point, people made a decision to reduce the number of lifeboats that were on board. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, which is truly trivial when we are talking about the safety of the 2,208 passengers that were on board that day. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were collapsible. This meant that, should they have had time to launch every single one, this would still only be enough for half of the passengers on board. That's a terrible ratio. And, as you may or may not know, during the sinking of the ship, not even all of the lifeboats were able to be launched as everything happened too quickly. There are quite a few lessons that can be and definitely were learned from the sinking of the Titanic, because the more we learn, the more we realize that the safety precautions taken for the ship simply were just not up to par. In our number 5 spot today, we have the card. In the remnants of the Titanic, there was an inspection card found that belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. This may seem like a mundane find, but it revealed a very grim story for the woman. Once the card was found, it was revealed that Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic that day, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of the passengers. The card showed that she was originally meant to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic. For some reason, the trip she originally had planned was delayed and she instead was assigned to the ill-fated Titanic. You can see that the word majestic was crossed out on her card, which shows us the change in plans. There clearly is no way anyone could have known or warned her. It's just a really tragic situation all around. In our number 4 spot today, we have slow action. While we were just talking about lifeboats, I mentioned how there wasn't enough time to launch all of the ones on board. This is true, and while the Titanic sank fairly quickly, there would have been more time if only people were more prepared. What I mean is that from the point where the ship actually hit the iceberg until the first lifeboats were launched was an entire hour. That is way too long when it is an emergency of this magnitude, which obviously leaves us wondering why. Well, as it turns out, a lot of people thought that the alarm bells were actually just a drill and they stayed inside where it was warm. This is already terrible, but what's even worse is that for the people who didn't think it was a drill, they had absolutely no idea where to go or what to do in the case of an emergency. They had never done any lifeboat drills, so everyone was just panicking with nowhere to go. Due to this lifeboat delay, there wasn't enough time to launch all of the remaining lifeboats successfully. This means that there are likely many lives that could have been saved had they had some more direction or prior training. In our number 3 spot today, we have ignored help. Only 20 miles away from the location of the sinking of the Titanic was another boat called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice, which was clearly a fantastic idea. What is pretty insane, however, is that the captain of this boat actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic, but he ignored them because he figured they were company rockets. And to make this matter even worse, the SOS signals that the Titanic was sending out weren't even received until the next day because the radio operator on the SS Californian had gone to sleep. By the time they heard these calls and arrived the next day, everyone had unfortunately already passed away and they weren't able to save anyone. Who knows what could have happened had they taken those emergency signals seriously? It's obviously not their fault, but it definitely makes you think. In our number 2 spot today, we have the band. We know how passionate musicians can be, and we know how healing music is for a lot of people. While I am absolutely sure that there was nothing that could be done to completely erase people's worries about what was going on, the ship's orchestra did what they could, which was to play music. The 8 orchestra members continued to play as the ship sank in order to try and keep spirits up, I'm sure for other passengers as well as themselves. At first it was widely believed that they did this because they were ordered to, and for the record, if this were the case, that would still have been insanely brave of them, but as it turns out, this is far from true. The band members were in fact not ship employees, which means that they had the same rights as any passenger to leave, but they chose not to. They all unfortunately passed away in the sinking of the ship, and they played until they couldn't anymore, which I think is horribly sad but also very beautiful and heroic of them. I'm sure that their heroism helped a lot of people who were also in this terrible situation, and I'm glad that their acts have been remembered even still. In our number 1 spot today, we have wrong turn. Okay, so we talked about how many warnings about the iceberg were ignored, but what happened when people finally stopped ignoring them? Well, once the iceberg was actually spotted, the chief officer received this warning and he ordered the helmsman to turn the wheel. Apparently this was actually a huge mistake, but it's unlikely they would have known that at the time. Researchers now believe that if they hadn't turned the wheel, the ship might not have sunk. The ship itself had bulkheads in the bow, so it is very likely that had the ship collided head-on with the iceberg, it actually would have been fine. They said that a head-on collision would have either stopped the ship from sinking at all, or it would have at least sunk a lot more slowly, which would have given more time for people to be rescued. It's easy for us to look back and say this would have been the best move, but under that kind of pressure, it's tough to see things as clearly as we can right now.
Kicking off list at number 10, first class. While traveling in first class may feel more comfortable when it came to the sinking of the Titanic, first class passengers had a better chance at survival. Just over 200 first class passengers survived out of the 324 souls traveling in first class during that fateful voyage. If you've seen the James Cameron film, you know women and children were first to board these lifeboats, and then it was first class men. By that point, there were a few lifeboats left, which I'll get into later on, that's a whole thing. But second class and third class, their chances at survival were not great. Being stored further and lower away from these lifeboats, it took longer to get there, especially with the rush and the crowds too. It was chaos. There were more than 700 third-class passengers. That number exceeded the other 2 classes combined. And those rooms were horrible. They were crammed. 4 people would have to share one tiny room, and each of the beds were smaller than twin beds. So when it comes to evacuating quickly, sadly these passengers had the hardest time getting out. Number 9. Locked doors. Ellen Hakarian was aboard the Titanic April 15, 1912, and back in September 1987, Tanky magazine published her survival story. It was titled Going Down with the Titanic in Third Class. Ellen and her husband Pekko decided to leave Finland and start a new life in America. The night of April 14th, after the couple had returned to their cabin and got settled in, they heard a loud scraping sound and the engine started to act up a bit. Pekko left the room to go and see what was going on. The hallway was tilted by time Ellen poked her head out moments later once she heard a ruckus in the hallway. There was then a knock at the door and one of her friends from Finland came and they said the ship was sinking, but Pekko was nowhere to be seen at this point. He was still gone. Her friend asked how did he get out of the passageway in the first place because all the doors are now locked. I was confused, I didn't know what to do next, and after a few moments I grabbed my purse and life jacket and ran out to the passageway. The door was locked. All the doors were locked. A steward finally came along to guide the crew to the third deck where they were taken to the Carpathia. They didn't arrive to a safe ship until the sun was up the next morning, and after losing her husband and all of her belongings, Aileen received $125. That's horrible. After that entire night, they're like, here's some money. That would be around $4,000 now, which is not enough to fix anything. Number 8, record time. It's been noted by many survivors that the Titanic was traveling quite fast, faster than anything they've experienced before. Well, that's because the ship's captain, Edward J. Smith, was trying to beat the crossing time of the Titanic's older White Star sibling. Now, there were already concerns about icebergs at this point, but the fact that the captain still went ahead at full speed, regardless of all the oncoming icebergs, well, sure didn't help. Astronomers at Texas State University at San Marcos discovered something cosmic that may have had something to do with the sinking of the Titanic that night. The alignment of the sun, the moon, and us on Earth could have created higher than normal tides in the Atlantic Ocean around January 1912. So by the time the Titanic was whipping through months later, icebergs that used to be stuck in the Labrador Sea could have gotten in the way. It also would have helped to see the iceberg approaching from afar. But number 7, no binoculars. On the night of the collision, binoculars were locked up the entire time. Of course, this could have possibly changed history, so why weren't they used? Where were they? Well, the key to the lockup was being held by Officer David Blair. Only before the Titanic's departure from Southampton, Officer Blair was pulled from the crew. Of course, this may not have made a difference at all, with all things considered, but it's important to note. To think these were stashed in a locker in the crow's nest this entire time is actually pretty haunting. Poor guy was transferred to another ship and forgot to give the key back. The amount of times I've taken a work key home with me, honestly, it's a simple mistake, so this is tragic. Number 6, wrong turn. It's the middle of the night, there aren't any binoculars at disposal, it's high tides, it's hard to see, but did the steersman accidentally point the Titanic towards the iceberg? Well, back in 2010, Louise Patton said this story was passed down from her grandfather, who just happened to be the most senior ship officer that survived that disaster. Apparently what happened was the iceberg was seen, and of course there was little time given the speed of the ship at that point, so command immediately issued to turn hard a starboard. That command was passed down a line like broken telephone. It was screamed past multiple people, so eventually the command was received as, make the ship turn right, rather than push the tiller to the right, which would have made the ship go left. It's confusing, and also at that moment, it's hard to hear. There's no chance this is anyone's fault. Number 5, not enough lifeboats. Before the Titanic set sail, at some point, a decision was made to reduce the number of lifeboats on board. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, and looking back now, it's honestly haunting to think that was once a thought, like that mattered at all. It just ruined the aesthetic, like, okay, sure. The safety of 2,208 passengers aboard, we could use some more boats. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were collapsible. 24 lifeboats, that's it. This meant that should they even have time to launch every single boat, this would only still be enough for half the passengers on board. Only half. And that's if it worked perfectly at that point. Even when the Titanic was going down, not all the lifeboats were able to be launched as everything unfolded quickly. Number 4, staying warm. The Titanic was obviously quite fancy. Its dining selections were fancy, the wines were fancy, it was all fancy, but alcohol was sadly reserved only for first class. The bar had 1,500 bottles of wine and 20,000 bottles of beer. Most of the people who passed away that night, it was because of icy temperatures in the water. I mentioned the alcohol and the cold water because one passenger named Charles Jogan, Charles was the baker on the ship, and when he realized the fate of the ship, it was probably going down, he drank everything he could see. He just chugged as much as he can. Honestly, I'm on board with drinking responsibly and all that, but if this was the case, yeah, of course, go for it. You don't want to be sober when this is happening. Charles was found 2 hours after the ship had completely gone down, somehow still treading water, and also somehow alive, and also extremely drunk. What happened here was the alcohol, the rather large amount of alcohol, slowed his heat loss, so he was able to hold on until help arrived, luckily. Number 2. An alternate trip. Not much was found of the Titanic afterwards. The pressure of the ocean, all those many secrets are truly lost to history. But there was an inspection card found. It belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. Now this may seem like a mundane find at first, but it revealed a grim story for the woman. Once the card was found, it was revealed that Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic that night, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of those passengers. The card shows that originally she was supposed to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic, but due to a coal strike, the Majestic voyage was delayed, and she instead was then assigned to the Titanic. On Marion's card, you can see Majestic crossed out, and the new trip says Titanic. It's grim, it's very heartbreaking. And finally, number 1, ignored flares. Barely 20 miles away from where the Titanic sunk, there was another boat. This one was called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice. The crew on the Titanic had also received warnings about the icebergs. The Titanic had actually received about 6 warnings before the collision. Only the first few were received by the captain. Now the captain of this other boat slowed down and actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic ahead, but he ignored them because he thought they were company rockets. And the SOS signals that the Titanic sent out as well weren't received until the next day because the radio operator on that SS Californian had gone to sleep. By the time they heard these calls and arrived the next day, it was of course too late.
In our number 10 spot today, we have musical instruments. 2 parts of a destroyed clarinet as well as a violin that was played by bandmaster Wallace Hartley were found among the wreckage of the Titanic. I know musical instruments aren't exactly a terrifying discovery, but the discovery reminds us of the heartbreaking story of the Titanic's band. As the Titanic sank, it is famously known that the band played on despite the absolutely horrific incident that was taking place around them. At first, it was widely believed that they did this because they were ordered to, and for the record, if this were the case, that still would have been insanely brave of them. But as it turns out, this is far from true. The band members were in fact not ship employees, which means that they had the same rights as any passengers to leave. So why didn't they? Well, it is now widely believed that it most likely was so that they could use their music to help calm people so that they wouldn't panic. That's some major bravery right there. In our number 9 spot today, we have a men's shoe. This artifact is one of the rarest to be shown of the items that have been recovered from the Titanic wreckage because of the fact that it is in such poor condition. All that remains of the shoe are the welt, top cap, and just a touch of the insole. This artifact does a couple things. It reminds you of the very real humans who became victims of this tragedy, and it also reminds you of the unrelenting nature of the ocean. Seeing the personal belongings of the passengers, regardless of knowing who specifically the shoe belonged to in their story, just adds a personal element, like you almost knew them. And then seeing how torn up the shoe has become is a strong reminder to us all that we truly are no match for Mother Nature, and the ocean is one of the most powerful and frightening things on the earth. In our number 8 spot today, we have a love letter. Richard Geddes was a cabin attendant on the Titanic who wrote a love letter to his wife while aboard, but unfortunately she would never go on to receive it. The letter was written on the original Titanic stationery, and it even had its original White Star Line envelope when it was found. While this story in itself is of course extremely sad, and again one of those reminders of the human side of those who were in this incident, this letter also contained something else beside utterings and confessions of love. It also featured a description that Richard wrote for his wife of a near collision that the Titanic had with the SS City of New York, obviously prior to the terrible iceberg incident. There were people who had witnessed this near collision and believed that it was a bad omen for the Titanic. In our number 7 spot today, we have a pocket watch. Okay, this artifact most certainly isn't the scariest one on today's list, but the story behind who it belonged to is one for the books. Sinai Cantor was 34 years old when he was a passenger on the Titanic. On board with him was his wife Miriam, and the pair were from Russia. They purchased second-class passenger tickets, which at the time cost them £26, which is about $3,666 in today's money. When tragedy struck and the Titanic was sinking, Sinai immediately thought of his wife. He was able to get her aboard one of the life rafts thankfully, and as far as I know, she was rescued from the icy waters. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for him, however, as he ended up being one of those who passed away in the sinking of the ship. During rescue efforts, this pocket watch ended up being recovered from his body. In our number 6 spot today, we have the inspection card. This inspection card once belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. What could possibly be worrisome about an inspection card? Well, it shows how Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of the passengers. The card shows that she was originally meant to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic. For some reason, the trip she originally had planned command was delayed and she instead was assigned to the ill-fated Titanic. You can see that the word majestic was crossed out on her card, which shows us the change in plans. If only people were able to see what was about to strike and could have warned her. In our number 5 spot today we have the Titanic radio. Okay, don't yell at me. This is a piece of the ship that has not yet been recovered, but it's the focus of much debate on whether or not it should be retrieved from the wreckage. Known in 1912 as the Marconi wireless telegraph machine, the radio on the Titanic sent distress calls to nearby ships that ended up saving the lives of 700 people in lifeboats. Despite how many people died in the Titanic tragedy, many of their bodies have never been recovered, which is why there were debates about whether or not to retrieve the artifact because of the fact that there might still be remains located in the same area as the radio is. Lawyers have argued against the recovery of the radio because the dive plan did not include the prospect of there being human remains located down there. It also was argued because in order to retrieve it, they would need to cut into the ship's radio compartment, which was strongly opposed by preservation advocates. As of right now, it appears as though the dive to retrieve the radio will still occur, but it isn't exactly clear when. This radio would be a very valuable artifact, but it also would hold an eerie tale of exactly when and how the radio was used during the final moments of the Titanic. In our number 4 spot today we have the telegraph. Separate from the radio we just talked about, the ship's telegraph machine was recovered in 1987, and this was used to relay commands to the engine room. So it was used as a communication device on board rather than to communicate with other ships. This telegraph machine is likely the one that was used to communicate to turn away from the iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, these commands came way too late as the ship struck the iceberg only 37 seconds after it was finally seen, and we all know what happened next. This telegraph was actually part of a Titanic auction that featured over 5,000 recovered artifacts that were selling for a combined some $200 million. In our number 3 spot today we have the bell. The bell from the crow's nest of the Titanic was recovered from the wreckage and returned to land, where it now resides in the Titanic Museum. The eerie story behind this bell is that it would have been the one that was rung 3 times by the lookout, Frederick Fleet, in order to attempt to warn of the iceberg that was ahead. Frederick, as well as the other lookout who was with him, Reginald Lee, both ended up thankfully surviving the incident and went on to later explain what happened from their point of view. They explained that if they had been given binoculars to assist with their job, they could have seen the iceberg sooner. When asked how much sooner, Frederick replied, "Well, enough to get out of the way." In our number 2 spot today we have the Big Piece. This was a 15-ton section of the Titanic that ended up being recovered from the ocean floor. The wreckage of the Titanic was not found until 1985 when oceanographer Robert Ballard was doing a secret underwater expedition. The Big Piece is about 26 by 12 feet and it was once a section of the ship's starboard side hull. This piece also has a part of the original support beam that attached this piece to the frame of the ship. It is said that where this piece was located on the ship, basically everything else around it was absolutely obliterated when the ship split in two. This artifact is said to be the reminder of the most violent aspect of the sinking of the ship, which is a horrifying thought. It was found among many other smaller pieces of the ship that had all been broken up. In our number 1 spot today we have this cherub statue. In the remnants of the Titanic, they recovered a broken cherub statue that once found its home on the grand staircase of the Titanic. Aside from cherubs just being kind of creepy in general, there's something exceptionally eerie about this piece of religious iconography being at the center of such a huge disaster, as well as being found among the wreckage years later. Cherubs are usually known as bearers of the throne or creatures who attend to God, so it's just a little creepy to have one at the scene of a terrible disaster, as well as it making through all of the years and years that the Titanic was underwater waiting to be found.
Kicking off our list at number 10, first class passengers. While traveling in first class it might feel more comfortable at first, but when it came to the sinking of the Titanic, first class passengers had a better chance at survival. You would think obviously, but here's why. Just over 200 first class passengers survived out of the 324 souls traveling in first class during that fateful voyage. That's a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people passed away, but in hindsight, a lot of people made it. If you've seen the James Cameron film, you know women and children were first to board these lifeboats, and then afterwards it was first class men. See, by that point there were few lifeboats left, which I'll get into of course later on, but second class and third class, their chances at survival here right off the bat were not great, simply because they were divided by class. Being stored further and lower from these lifeboats, the odds weren't in their favor. There were more than 700 third class passengers, and that number exceeded the other two classes combined. It's horrible. Those rooms were crammed. 4 people would have to share one tiny room, and the beds were smaller than twin beds. So when it comes to evacuating quickly, sadly these passengers had the hardest time getting out, which we don't often think of when we think of, the Titanic and the sinking of it. Number 9, the band. We know how passionate musicians can be, and we know that music can heal a lot of people, of course. While I'm absolutely sure there was nothing that could have been done to completely erase people's worries about what was about to happen on the Titanic that fateful night, the ship's orchestra did what they could, which was to play music, and I'm sure that helped somebody in some way, shape, or form. It wasn't just in the movie, right? The 8 orchestra members continued to play as the ship sank in order to try and keep spirits up. First, it was widely believed that they did this because they were ordered to, and for the record, if this were the case, that still would have been insanely brave of them too, but it turns out this is far from the truth. See, the band members were in fact not ship employees at the time, which means they technically had the same rights as any other passenger to leave and board a ship, but they chose not to. They all unfortunately passed away in the sinking of the ship, and they played until they couldn't anymore, which I think is horribly sad, but also very beautiful and heroic of them. The film can't quite capture the beauty. I'm sure that their heroism helped a lot of people who were also in this terrible situation, and I'm glad their acts have been remembered, even still. Number 8, locked doors. Ellen Hakarian was aboard the Titanic that fateful night, and Tanky magazine actually published her survival story afterwards, titled Going Down with the Titanic in Third Class. Yeah, I mentioned the first class differences between third class, so this story here is already a feat in itself. Ellen and her husband, Pekko, decided to leave Finland and start a new life in America. The night of April 14th, after the couple had returned to their cabin and got settled in, they heard a loud scraping sound, and the engines then started to act up. Pekko ran out to see what was going on. The hallway was tilted by the time Ellen poked her head out moments later, once she heard a ruckus in the hallway. Then there was a knock at the door. One of her friends from Finland came in, and they said the ship was sinking, but Pekko was nowhere to be seen, and her friend asked, how did he get out of the passageway? All the doors are locked. I was confused. I didn't know what to do next. After a few moments, I grabbed my purse and life jacket and ran out to the passageway. The door was locked. All of the doors were locked. A steward finally came along to guide the crew to third deck, where they were then taken to the Carpathia, and they didn't arrive to a safe ship until the sun was up the following day. So after losing her husband and all of her belongings, Ellen only received $125. That's all the ship could give them. They're like, we're sorry you lost everything. Here's the best we can do. That's it. Number 7, no binoculars. On that fateful night of the collision with the iceberg, binoculars were locked up the entire time. Now, of course, this could have changed literal history had they have been used, but why weren't they? The key to said lockup storing the binoculars was being held by Officer David Blair. Only before the Titanic's departure from Southampton, Officer Blair was pulled from the crew. Now, of course, this may not have made a difference at all, but it's important to note. To think that these were stashed in a locker in the crow's nest the entire time is haunting now when you consider the history of it. The poor guy was transferred to another ship and forgot a key. The amount of times I've forgotten a key or taken a work key home by accident, I mean, it's a simple mistake, but in this case, tragedy, really. Number 6, ignored flares. Just 20 miles away from where the Titanic sunk, there was another boat. This one was called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice, and the crew on the Titanic had also received warnings about icebergs. The Titanic had received 6 warnings about icebergs before the collision. Now, while the first few warnings were received by the captain, not all 6 were. Why so? The captain of this other boat, he slowed down and actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic ahead, but he ignored them because he thought that they were company rockets. The SOS signals that the Titanic was sending out weren't received until the next day because the radio operator on that SS Californian had gone to sleep. Yep, he took a little power nap after ignoring all the flares. By the time they had heard these calls and arrived the next day, it was obviously too late, sadly. Number 5, less lifeboats. Before the Titanic even set sail during the preparation for the journey, at some point, people made a decision to reduce the number of lifeboats that were on board. Why they did this? Beats me, I don't know. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, which is truly trivial when we're talking about the safety of, 2,208 passengers that were on board that day. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were, collapsible. So 24-ish lifeboats, 2,208 passengers. Doesn't add up. It's not, it's a terrible ratio. Which means they should have had time to launch every single one, but this would still be only enough for half the passengers on board. It was cursed from the get-go. And as you may or may not know, during the sinking of the ship, not even all the lifeboats were able to be launched as everything happened too quickly, and it was chaos. There are quite a few lessons that can be definitely learned from the sinking of the Titanic, because the more we learn, the more we realize that the safety precautions taken for these ships simply were just not up to par. It wasn't really about the iceberg. I mean, that did it, but there were other things that could have helped. Number 4, the card. In the remnants of the Titanic, there was an inspection card found that belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. This must seem like any ordinary find after a wreck, but it revealed a grim story for the woman. Once the card was found, it was then revealed that Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic at all, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of the passengers. The card shows us that she was originally meant to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic, but for some reason the trip she'd originally planned was delayed and she instead was assigned to the ill-fated Titanic. You can see the word Majestic was actually crossed out on her card, which shows us the change in plans. It's so haunting to look at now. There's no way anybody could have known or warned her. It's just a really tragic situation to look back on. And to physically see the cancellation of the ship gives me goosebumps. It's really horrible. Number 3, Eliza Millvina Dean. This story really is something, okay, buckle up. When thinking back to this tragedy, it's hard to imagine how it looked in real time, like being on the ship, right? I mean, not from James Cameron's perspective, right? It was a moonless night in the pitch black. Of course the navigation was hard. Of course it could have been handled better, or they could have listened to the numerous warnings, but again, it was pitch black. This is what the iceberg looked like in real life. Eliza Dean was only a newborn on the Titanic. Her parents were on the way to the States with everything that they owned packed up in their luggage. See, Eliza's father was actually on the deck at the time of the collision, so he saw the ship hit that iceberg. How terrifying is that? But in doing so, he knew in that moment, get the family, hit the deck, something bad's gonna happen. Even as third-class passengers, they were thankfully some of the first on the lifeboats, which is incredible seeing as what I said earlier. It was Eliza, her brother, and her mother. They all got aboard safely, but her father, of course, never made it off, which is terrible, but his quick thinking saved his family. Number 2, John Jacob Astor. As the ship was sinking, the first-class passenger, John Jacob Astor, he put his young wife on one of the lifeboats and he was about to get in with her when he immediately saw 2 terrified children standing behind him. And it happened. He instead gave up his spot and let those other 2 children on the boat, which is just noble, it's brave, it's heroic. It's something that you ask yourself, could I do that? If it actually were to happen, would I have the willpower to do that? I hope so. This is absolute bravery. One of the Titanic survivors, named Philip Mock, saw John in one of his final moments later on after this brave moment. He saw him and his valet huddled together on one of the life rafts before they unfortunately froze in the cold water. It's tragic. This was indeed a very tragic event, but the positive news here is that both his wife and the child that she was carrying at the time were able to make it to safety, and they survived the entire ordeal. While there are many terrible stories from this day, we also don't hear enough about the bravery that people showed during this tragic event. And finally, number 1, Molly Brown. In total, there were 706 people who survived the sinking of the Titanic. Molly Brown has been referred to as the unsinkable Molly Brown, and when you look into her story, it really checks out. Margaret Brown not only survived the Titanic, which is just an incredible feat in itself, and the odds there are just incredible, but once aboard the life ship, she threatened the quartermaster. She said she'll throw him overboard if he didn't go back immediately and start looking for more survivors. That's badass. That is something I will do. I hope I can do in a moment like this. That's incredible. Historically, this is where the accounts get a little hazy. See, it's not confirmed whether the boat actually went back to look, but after narrowly surviving a tragedy, then you're barely conscious. You still think of other people? That's the moral of the story here. Margaret was traveling in Egypt, but when a grandchild got sick, she ended her trip early just to go back to the States and take care of them. When she got all this attention after surviving said disaster, she then campaigned publicly for women's rights and education for the poor. She was a badass in the boat and then a badass afterwards. Like, this is insane. There was a musical comedy in the 60s called The Unsinkable Molly Brown, so her name will be remembered for a while. As it should be. Thank you, Molly.
Coming up at our number 10 spot, we have the couldn't shower woman. This person on Reddit mentioned that throughout her whole life, she has been obsessed with the Titanic, but in a way where she has always feared it. Her biggest fear was the Titanic for so long, not bugs or monsters under the bed. It was always the Titanic. She subsequently feared water because she would constantly have flashes of being on the Titanic when in water, and especially if it was cold. Her memories and thoughts were so vivid that she actually had a hard time showering and would have her sister sit in the bathroom with her until she was 17 years old. Whenever she would see pictures of sunken ships, and specifically when she saw pics of the Titanic, she would get anxious, even though sometimes she would seek them out. She doesn't have any specific memories, just flashes of staring up at the boat as it was sinking, and it has completely altered her life. That's wild. Imagine being so scared that you would literally need someone someone to be in the bathroom with you while you shower. She either was actually on the Titanic or she really needs to speak to someone about her active imagination. That would be so terrifying to experience. In our number 9 spot, we have The Water is Coming. A woman's son that chose to remain nameless had an obsession with the Titanic. He was constantly talking about the Titanic and wanting to watch the movie, and so one day she decided to take him to the Titanic exhibit. After going there, he began to have night terrors, and one night in particular she would never forget. She was watching TV when she heard loud banging in her son's room. She went inside to see him on all fours and heard him yell, "Go, go, go, the water is coming." And then he let out a scream. But it wasn't his voice. It was the voice of an older man coming out of him. Apparently after that incident, her son started to talk about it less, and she chalked it up to that maybe his soul had come to terms with the catastrophe and was more at peace. Wow. I definitely would have been extremely terrified if I had witnessed this. I wouldn't have been able to go back to sleep, at least, that's for sure. In our number 8 spot, we have Michael Kushner. A TikToker and photographer by the name of Michael Kushner explained his Titanic story and how he has memories from the incident. In his explanation, he spoke about how around 7 years old is when you start to lose your memories from a past life, and when he was 7, he saw the Titanic movie 4 times, and every time he saw the sinking scene, he felt that something wasn't right. Throughout his life, the Titanic followed him everywhere. When he moved to London, it was the 100-year anniversary, and on the day he landed, a ship sunk, and everyone was saying that it was just like the Titanic. The first playbill he ever photographed was called The Unsinkable Molly Brown. And even James Cameron, the director of the Titanic, said he didn't feel the sinking scene was depicted accurately and explained why, and Michael said that his explanation aligned with what he felt. Out of all of the stories that I'm going to tell you about today, this guy definitely feels like he could have been on the Titanic in another life. Would love to know your thoughts in the comment section below. In our number 7 spot, we have Paul Emerald. Paul Emerald is a Los Angeles producer that took part in a series of past life regressions for a television show he was working on. What he found, though, led to a journey that he did not expect, and he even wrote a book on it. He was convinced for so long that he wasn't going to live past the age of 25, and when he started doing these regressions, he realized that he had a lot of weird similarities with a passenger that died on the ship named John Jack Phillips, who was 25 when the boat sank. He decided to visit John's hometown, and it was there that he experienced major deja vu, like he knew where everything was. So he did some more regressions and saw John's whole life. He is convinced that John was him in another life. Wow, that's an incredible story. Imagine just going to a random town and knowing where everything is because you were there in another life. In our number 6 spot, we have the mysterious Reddit user. This is told by a Reddit user who explained that he always had a fascination with the Titanic and an overwhelming amount of sadness and empathy around the situation. He explains that he's not a very empathetic person, but for some reason he feels an increased amount of empathy for those that died on the ship. This user always freaks out when it comes to water, and drowning is one of their biggest fears. They did a past life meditation to see if they could get a name, but only got a picture of being somewhere cold and icy. So interesting. I think it's possible that maybe there's a lot of people out there that didn't actually die on the Titanic, but they did die on like a shipwreck in a past life, and then maybe it would make sense why they would resonate with the Titanic, but who knows? In our number 5 spot, we have A Love to Remember. A 19-year-old woman by the name of Amanda remembered being on the Titanic with her past love. She remembered being a first-class passenger by the name of Julia who met her man named Mark on board the ship. They both ended up taking a lifeboat together and surviving the disaster, and later on ended up getting married. Amanda said that she has a hard time finding love in her life nowadays because no one quite meets the standards of her previous love. Aw, that's sweet and terribly sad. Hopefully she ends up finding him again in this life. In our number 4 spot, we have the claustrophobic man. This person is another Reddit user that very much considers themselves to have died on the Titanic in a past life, and their justification? They hate being cold and can't swim well. Interesting. He said, "I'm deeply claustrophobic, and so maybe I got trapped somehow, but all I know is that I've been deeply fascinated by the Titanic and the movie." Do you think think it's possible that the movie casted some kind of spell on people around the world, and because it felt so lifelike, people just felt as if they were there? Another user commented that they did lock passengers in the steerage, so it's possible this person was one of those passengers. Coming up in our number 3 spot, we have the girl with the green eyes. This person believed they were on the Titanic because of a past life regression circle that they took part in. This person is a part of a pagan group, and one day they were doing a past life regression exercise, and she saw herself go down a long hallway with white walls and wood paneling and a plush red carpet and a fancy wooden door at the end of the hallway. Honestly, this sounds like the final scene from the movie, but I'm gonna go on. Anyway, she goes into a room filled with water, and a girl comes up to her with piercing green eyes and a blue lily crystal hairpin in her hair. Her eyes were filled with tears. They got into a lifeboat together, but then the girl got out and continued to hold her hand. Once they lowered the boat, her hand slipped from the girl's hand as they were separated. Interesting. I swear something like that happens in the movie as well. I really wonder what people were saying before the movie came out and if their experiences were described similarly then. In our number 2 spot, we have Alfred Peacock. A young boy that was born 2 years after the sinking of the Titanic would have tons of visions of being on the Titanic growing up. He felt that he was on the Titanic and couldn't imagine any other explanations for his visions. He remembered being a young boy on the Titanic and that he lived in the 3rd class cabin with his family. He remembered that his name started with an A and ended with an E and a D, and that led him to think that his name was Alfred. After doing some research of the passengers that died on the ship, he came across an Alfred Peacock that was young on the ship, and he believed that his memories were then confirmed. In our number 1 spot, we have Charles Latoller. A man remembers being a passenger on the Titanic that went by the name of Charles Latoller. Charles was a British sailor who was a 2nd officer on board the Titanic. He did not die on the Titanic, he was one of the survivors, and went on to live till the 50s. So this person must not be too old if he feels that he really was him in another life. He has flashes of walking down the staircase on the ship and seeing beautiful gowns. He always felt connected to the Titanic, and after discovering a picture of Charles, he knew he felt a connection with it, and he felt that it was himself. In June of 2001, when he was writing a book about the Titanic, a woman randomly came up to him in a coffee shop and told him that he was on the Titanic, and opened up one of his research books of the Titanic and pointed to an officer, and sure enough, she pointed to Charles Latoller.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have this haunting call. Whales truly are some of the coolest animals on Earth, and humpback whales are no exception. The males of the species are known for their songs, which last from 10 to 20 minutes and are actually pretty complex. They will repeat these songs for hours at a time, and it honestly isn't exactly known why they sing these songs at all. All the males in the group will produce the same song, and it will change seasonally. The females are also able to produce noise, but for some reason it is only the males who seem to produce these long songs. It is unclear how the whales even produce these sounds, however, because they don't actually have vocal cords. This is all super cool and interesting, but the whole reason you're here is for the sound, so let's take a listen to a more haunting track released by the humpback whale. Okay, so please tell me I'm not alone in thinking that that was the most beautifully haunting sound I've ever heard come from the sea. But also imagine being alone in the ocean, not knowing what that was, and then hearing it. Probably pretty terrifying, right? At least we're all safe here in YouTube land. In our number 9 spot today, we have this marine chorus. Okay, so out of context, if I played you this sound, what would you think it is? Definitely not something underwater, right? Well, as it turns out, this sound was indeed captured under the water, and these are the sounds of fish calls. While I always expected the chorus of marine animals to sound a little more similar to the stylings of Sebastian the crab, apparently that isn't even close. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't even know that most fish had calls, but it turns out that our human ears just can't perceive all of the hoots, moans, barks, and chirps that take place in the vast seas. This recording actually helped scientists realize that there are fish who sing together in a chorus every day at dusk and dawn. There have now been around 800 species of fish that have been identified and confirmed to make some form of noise, and apparently some fish even engage in shouting matches in noisier parts of the ocean, which is kind of hilarious to imagine. I guess on the list of creepy noises, this one is less creepy and more just informative. In our number 8 spot today we have the whistle. This is a sound that was first recorded in 1997 by the NOAA and was the source of many mysteries for years while people speculated about what may have caused the sound. While it still isn't exactly clear, it is now believed that the sound may have come from an underwater volcano eruption. If you didn't know, underwater or submarine volcanoes are located in all oceans on our Earth, and they're extremely interesting. There are certain kinds of marine animals that only exist near these extreme environments. Many submarine volcanoes are located near the areas of tectonic plate formations, which are also known as mid-ocean ridges. There's a YouTube user called Some Canadian, and they left a comment on a video of this whistle sound that pretty much sums it up exactly. First, we'll listen to the sound played at 10 times the original speed. The comment read, quote, "It could be the sound of something moving through tunnels. 1. Volcanic eruptions and gases. 2. Something big and hungry. You choose." I think they might really be onto something there. In our number 7 spot today we have Bloop. Why are all of the weirdest ocean sounds first recorded in 1997? Bloop is another one that came from that year, and it was a loud and unusual sound that was placed as occurring several times off the southern coast of South America, and it was so loud that it could be heard over 5,000 kilometers away. At first, researchers were confused because, while the sound was actually similar to known sounds of living creatures, it was just way too loud that not even the blue whale, the largest living creature, could have produced it. So what is it then? Well, as it turns out, it is in fact not the Kraken, and instead it is actually consistent with ice quakes that are generated by large icebergs as they crack and fracture. It seems like this sound, going with that explanation, doesn't really make sense, but hey, I'm no scientist. But here's the sound for you to judge for yourself. In our number 6 spot today we have the Western Pacific Biotwang. In 2014, researchers and scientists heard weird sounds coming from the Mariana Trench, which, for the record, seems like the worst place for there to be strange noises coming from. For years, experts couldn't pin down this sound, and it was dubbed the Western Pacific Biotwang, and while there is now a theory that was proposed by researchers from Oregon State University, they have also said that they might be entirely wrong. First, for reference, here's a little clip of the sound I'm talking about. Okay, so if you're like me, my mind immediately went to something alien related or some sort of creature that perhaps we haven't yet discovered. I mean, this is the Mariana Trench we're talking about. The theory put forward by the Oregon State researchers was that perhaps this may be a new type of baleen whale call. Okay, that's probably the best of all of the options, but I really don't like when someone tells me the answer to a scientific mystery only to tell me that that might not actually be the answer at all. While the low part of the sound would make sense to attribute to the baleen whale, it's the end high-pitched twangy part that would be incredibly unique. The wide range of frequencies in the sound are what continues to baffle those who are trying to find the source of this mysterious sound. In our number 5 spot today we have Julia. Julia is a sound that was recorded in 1999 by the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, which I've already talked about today. It sounds like it could be straight out of a horror movie, so considering it was a sound that came from our ocean and at first no one could tell where it had come from, it really was quite frightening. This sound has now likely been demystified, as researchers are pretty positive they know the origin of it. It is now believed that this sound was caused by an iceberg running aground off Antarctica. The sound, however, was insanely loud. It was so loud that it could be heard over the entire equatorial Pacific Ocean autonomous hydrophone array. Researchers were later able to narrow down what they believe may have been the point where the sound originated, although they've never actually been able to pinpoint it exactly. Most of the time when people hear the Julia sound, they hear it sped up at 16 times the original speed, but today we are going to listen to a clip of the sound at regular speed because I think it is much more eerie this way. In our number 4 spot today we have knock. Okay, this is one that I'll admit was not captured by a submarine, but it was still underwater and it truly is terrifying. A few years ago, a beluga whale named Nock, who was unfortunately in captivity, was recorded as he swam below the water. Beluga whales have been called the canaries of the sea, and for good reason, but Nock really wanted to up the ante and instead blessed us all with this sound. Nock had this uncanny ability to mimic the rhythm and tone of human voices, and it truly is kinda frightening. It of course is also a little sad, as part of this was probably because he spent most of his life being forced to listen to humans speak because he was being held in captivity. Before this recording of Nock, the voices of belugas and their sometimes human-like sounds have been talked about, but Nock was the first time it was recorded, and honestly, I kind of wish it hadn't been. In our number 3 spot today we have the bioduck. Since the 1960s, this sound has absolutely stumped researchers who heard it. This sound was basically what the name attributed to it would suggest. It sounded like some sort of mechanical duck. For decades, researchers would hear this sound and it would often be heard and recorded again in the spring and winters. After all of these years though, it seems as though the answers to this mysterious sound are finally coming to light. In 2013, researchers attached sensors that collect acoustic data to 2 whales. One of those tags recorded for 18 hours and the other for 8, and the whales they were attached to were traveling with other whales in groups of 5 to 40, and they were all eating basically the entire time. Throughout this time, with the tags on the whales, there were a total of 32 calls heard, and this data is what led researchers to finally understand where the bioduck sound was coming from. As it turns out, this mysterious sound was actually the call of the minke whale. Researchers still aren't exactly clear as to what the call means to the whales, but it was a fantastic discovery that finally closed an almost 50-year-old scientific mystery. In our number 2 spot today we have Upsweep. We all know how little we know about the ocean, and that also includes what kind of creatures lie in it. So while this mysterious sound out of context probably wouldn't be that freaky, when put into this situation it becomes quite a bit more eerie. This sound is referred to as upsweep, and it was caught when the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory started its sound surveillance system in August of 1991. The sound is apparently more seasonal, with its peaks in spring and fall, but it is unclear if the changing of seasons is responsible for this sound, or if it's coming from something that lurks in the ocean and remains undiscovered. Just for reference, here's a clip of that sound played at 20 times the original speed. It is possible that this sound could be coming from underwater volcanic activity, but it is also possible that it's not, so who really knows? In our number 1 spot today we have an earthquake. Okay, so to add another creepy Mariana Trench sound to this list, we have one that was taken from the bottom of the Challenger Deep. In fact, it was the first ever sound recording to be taken from the bottom of the Challenger Deep, so it's a pretty cool scientific advancement as well as a terrifying sound. Despite the crushing pressures and the fact that there's no sunlight, the Challenger Deep is actually pretty noisy, and that is because of the fact that sound travels a really long way underwater, which ends up kind of turning the Challenger Deep into a sort of echo chamber of oceanic sounds. So while the recording was able to pick up things like the sound of a boat almost 11 kilometers overhead and the sounds of whale calls, they were also able to pick up the sound of a magnitude 5 earthquake rumbling near Guam on July 16th, 2015. Gonna lie, while being one of the scariest things I've ever heard, this is also one of the coolest things I've ever heard in my life too. Science really is just so cool sometimes. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have the train. The train is a sound that was first recorded on March 5th, 1997. It is often referred to as the train because, well, it kind of sounds like a train's whistle, or maybe like the sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks, but in my opinion, it just sounds like a ghost meetup. Despite the years it's been since this sound was captured, no one is entirely sure where it came from. The current belief is that it may have been from an extremely large iceberg in the Ross Sea near Cape Adare, but that is still only a guess. The steady hum might be the sound of the keel of an iceberg dragging across the sea floor, but What if it's not? In our number 9 spot today we have this underwater knocking. This knocking sound was picked up by an underwater hydrophone, and for a while it had people stumped until they were able to find the culprit. Before we talk about what this sound is coming from, imagine being in the deep, dark, icy waters and hearing that sound. It is straight up out of a horror movie, but as it turns out, the real source isn't quite as scary. This is actually the sound of a species of haddock fish. These types of haddock are a ray-finned fish that can be found in the North Atlantic Ocean. The males of the species will produce this drumming or pulsating sound in order to attract mates during the mating season. Outside of the mating season, a similar sound is also produced, and that is known to be used during aggressive encounters with other male fish. In our number 8 spot today we have the 52 Hertz Whale. This whale has been nicknamed the loneliest whale in the world, but the truth is, we don't even really know if that's true because we've never actually seen it. This whale, which we don't know if it's male or female or what whale species it belongs to, sings its song like no other whale does. This whale was first heard in 1989 on a hydrophone, and while the calls were most similar to that of a blue whale, there was one striking difference, and that was the frequency of the calls. This whale calls at 52 Hz with regular blue whales calling between 10 and 40 Hz. Even fin whales are usually heard at 20 Hz, so it left everyone stumped as to what could be going on here. A researcher named Bill Watkins dedicated his life to trying to reveal what exactly was going on here, and while he passed away in 2004, he found that this whale was not only unusual, but totally unique. The biggest challenge is the fact that we cannot locate this whale. Their calls can be heard for hundreds of miles, and trying to find one single whale in the vastness of the ocean is next to impossible. Many people have suggested that perhaps the whale is deaf, and this is what has led to its unique song, but of course without the whale, how would we possibly know for sure? In our number 7 spot today we have Slow Down. Slow Down is another sound that was captured in 1997, but this one was captured on May 19th of that year. The 90s was apparently the height of the capturing weird, unexplained ocean sounds wave because wow, there are so many. This sound got its name because of the fact that the sound descends in frequency over about 7 minutes. Again, this is another sound I would have just assumed was ghosts, but luckily there are people out there who know more than me who continue to research these things and try to get to the bottom of these mysteries. This sound was so loud it was detected by different sensors nearly 5,000 kilometers apart from each other. Scientists were able to locate the sound as coming from somewhere off the Antarctic Peninsula. While they couldn't directly find the source of the sound, they used their deductive reasoning, and it is currently believed that the sound might have been the result of a drifting iceberg as it scratched the seafloor until it slowly came to a stop. I guess the icebergs were just moving around a lot in the mid to late 90s. In our number 6 spot today we have the Sigh Whale. Here we are again with another whale sound that just truly doesn't seem like it should be the sound coming out of any living creature, but hey, in the sea the rules are just different and everything's a little weirder. These whales can be found in subtropical, temperate, and subpolar waters around the world. They're sadly a species that has seen their numbers decrease rapidly, especially due to the historical commercial whaling that took place in the 19th and 20th centuries. The exact number of these whales that currently exist is unknown, but they are a species that is currently listed as being threatened. Like many other whales, these guys use their voice to communicate with one another, and that is where this sound comes from. Other than the sound that they're making, the increase in noise under the water, especially man-made noise, is actually a threat to their existence. The sound can interrupt their normal behavior and drive them away from areas that are important to their survival, and sometimes intense exposure to noise can even cause one of these whales to strand and die, which truly is just awful. In our number 5 spot today we have Star Wars. Okay, you might be wondering why something relating to Star Wars is on this list since we are talking about the sea, but just listen to the sound and then tell me what you think. That sounds kinda like little fighter jets or something, right? Well, it definitely had some people stumped for a while when it was first heard, but luckily this one has a fairly simple and harmless explanation. The Star Wars sound is actually coming from dwarf minke whales. Apparently a lot of strange ocean noises end up either being attributed to whales or icebergs. Considering how creepy this sound can be when they have no explanation, I'm kind of glad to know that most things end up being relatively harmless and way less scary in reality. In our number 4 spot today we have the Atlantic cod. Atlantic cod are known for their ability to produce clicks, growls, and thumps as their way of communicating. The clicks I'm about to show you are apparently intended to ward off potential predators, including humans, and I truly feel like it might be working. While this sound was recorded on a hydrophone, it's been said that divers who have encountered these fish in the ocean have also been able to hear these warning clicks so as to let them know not to get close. These fish also of course have different, less aggressive sounds as well that they use for things like mating season or to be able to warn others of their kind of potential dangers that are lurking in the icy waters. In our number 3 spot today we have the ping. This is a sound that no one has been able to figure out where it is coming from. I'll admit this one wasn't captured by a submarine, but I had to include it because it is coming from the water and it is so mysterious that scientists and even the military still aren't sure what exactly is going on here. This sound can be heard in the Kikitalik region of the Canadian territory Nunavut and is coming from the Fury and Hecla Strait. This sound has been described by some as a ping and by others as a hum, but the main issue is that this area is a hunting area, and whatever the sound is, it is scaring off all of the wildlife. Because of the reports of this mysterious sound, even the military came to investigate, but still, no one is exactly sure where this sound could have been coming from or what it could be linked to. For now, the mysteries that lay below the Arctic ice are destined to remain a secret. In our number 2 spot today we have This sound is one that was captured on a hydrophone and it truly sounds like someone just trying to add some inflection to their voice to ask a question. I'll give you 1 second to take a guess first. Did you guess another whale? Well, you'd be right then. This sound is coming from the North Atlantic right whale and is not just the sound of a super confused person. These whales are one of the world's endangered large whale species, with there being only 400 left in the Atlantic Ocean. The sound you just heard is the sound they use to communicate with others of their species. Their sounds are usually low frequency moans or groans, and they are used to indicate things like warnings, contact, aggression, or just other social signals in general. In our number 1 spot today we have boom. Okay, maybe the last one was a little too easy, so here's another sound that I'm gonna let you guess, and maybe it will be a little harder this time. Do you have a guess as to what that big boom was? Apparently, that sound was caught on a hydrophone and it is coming from an underwater oil rig. Remember when we were talking about the man-made sound pollution of the deep sea and how it affects the marine life? This is exactly the kind of thing we were talking about. I don't have the solution on how to make it better or how to fix the problem. All I know is that it is one, and honestly, how could it not be? That sound freaked me out while I was sitting comfortably at my desk researching, so I can imagine hearing it when I wasn't expecting it in the comfort of my own home. That just sounds awful.
Number 9. Shifting plates. I remember this back in 2013. I hope this rings a bell for some of you watching. In 2013, a woman in British Columbia, over in Canada, heard a trumpet sound, a low, slow, like a trumpet, or so she thought. At first, nothing came from these claims or videos, just a few comments saying, that's weird, which it is, but then it started to happen in areas all over the world, from Texas to Norway, so something's going on. It's the same slow, loud trumpet sound. Well, it turns out this sound was coming from the ocean this whole time, because again, in 2018, a little more recently, the same low-pitched humming noise was heard in Hawaii, Kenya, and then Chile. So what we're hearing all these years are shifting tectonic plates. That's our best guess at this point. Undersea volcanoes, sure, just moving some deep-sea furniture around. It's gotta be loud. Some folk believe that there's another dimension underneath the ocean floor, so maybe this is just a door opening and closing. Maybe this is the bouncer being like, oh, come on in, okay. Either way, I'm good here on land, never going down there. Number 8, quacker. Quaker oats, quacker oats, the quacker. Not to be confused with the Kraken, he's a little bit different. This is the quacker. A loud quack was heard during the Cold War, so a little bit older. It was recorded while Soviet Navy ballistic missile submarines were heading through North Atlantic and Arctic waters. They heard quacking or ribbit, something like some sort of deep sea duck. Whenever submarines passed a certain area, this loud quack would come from deep below, and it came from an object that was moving around. That's the mysterious part. That's why we threw it on our list today. The Soviets thought they were overhearing secret US best tech, you know, like I guess some deep sea duck radar. I've heard rumors of that one, that's good. That was in a James Bond movie for sure. Scientists believe that it came from a giant squid, which is somehow more alarming than the ocean floor. Number 7, underwater Underworld. Back in 2018, a diver was exploring flooded caves in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. They were on the beach having a good time, then they saw this opening about 1.5 feet wide, barely enough to fit one person, and this diver was like, they went through. That's terrifying. First of all, bravo, hats off, that's extremely brave. But then they found this underwater tunnel that connected the Saskatoon Cave and the Dos Ojos cave system. So this is a huge discovery because now this is considered one of the largest underwater cave systems in the world. In total, it runs about 347 kilometers long. I can't even fathom how long that is underwater. This cave has been untouched since the last ice age, rightfully so. And the 200 pockets inside are filled with bones, Mayan altars, fossils belonging to now extinct animals. It's basically a time capsule from 15,000 years ago. So if you're diving through small cave entrances, you know, don't go alone, or you might get stuck in time, apparently. Or you might find thousands of bones, or a possible entrance to the underworld. Yeah, that's also a hot rumor for this underwater Mayan cave system. I forgot my flippers. Can't go, sorry guys. Have fun though, sounds like a great time. Number 6, Titan Ocean. This one is literally out of this world. Coming from one of the many moons of Saturn, Titan, around 10 years ago, NASA's Cassini spacecraft detected water underneath its massive shell of ice. That's pretty exciting. To quote a Cassini team member, the search for water is an important goal in solar system exploration, and now we've spotted another place where it's abundant. NASA has also detected low-frequency radio waves on this moon before, so perhaps there's something going on under the space sea. Our own ocean is mysterious enough, let alone receiving signals from an ocean in space. No thanks, I don't want to even think about what's up there. Number 5, the Kraken. Jack Sparrow's worst nightmare. Is it real? Is the Kraken actually a real thing? Where does this come from? Well, maybe. The giant squid is not that far-fetched. Some creatures in the ocean are massive as is, like for example, this manta ray off the coast of Trinidad. If the internet didn't exist and I saw this in real life, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. So of course, many sailors reported seeing the Kraken at one point or another. The ocean's terrifying. For ages now, sailors specifically from Norway and Greenland have all continued to share eyewitness reports of a giant sea monster, the Kraken. Apparently it had tentacles big enough to pull you and your mateys right off of the ship. In 1857, Danish naturalist Japetus Steenstrup found a large squid beak, and then soon after he was sent parts of another specimen from the Bahamas, so people were trying to help him out. So he concluded with all these gross puzzle pieces that the Kraken is real, and it's part of a species of giant squid called Architeuthis dux, which is Latin for ruling squid. Very little is known about giant squids, seeing as they're so hard to track, but we did get a photo of one back in 2005 and a video of one in 2013. Number 3, the Green Flash. I watch way too many superhero movies, so this next one had me pacing around my living room for a hot minute. Who is this? Who is this guy? Who's this Green Flash man? The Green Flash phenomena happens in the ocean. So far, we've only observed the flash above water, but I'm sure there's some mysterious happenings going on below, you know? I'm sure there's a few confused fish over there when it happens. This happens during sunset and sunrise. Best time to see the Green Flash is on a clear evening over water, and the air must be clean. So if you're in a polluted city, you're like, damn it. The reason we see a green flash is because of our boy, Roy G. Biv. This is the G in Roy G. Biv. Sunlight reflects off the atmosphere like a big old prism, and in turn, for thousands of years, humans have probably been like, what was that? I just saw a green flash. I keep seeing it every night. What is going on? They're probably so confused for thousands of years. No, it's not a Justice League villain. It's just the sunset. Number 2, HMS Daedalus. This 19th century warship belonged to the Royal Navy. It was this big class beauty equipped with 19 guns, and it launched at Woolwich Dockyard in 1844. It was a big deal. 4 years later, Captain McEway, along with his officers and crew, all set sail to St. Helena, but during their commute, they were visited. Yeah, this is why we have the guns on the side of the ship. If any trouble comes along, be it pirates, whatever the case, we're now equipped. Thing is, this visitor didn't come from the sides or the front or the back, it came from below, in the form of a 60-foot long serpent. And it hung around for 20 minutes, apparently, with its head breaking the surface of the water occasionally. The captain said it was so close under the ship that if it was one of his own crew members under there, he could have easily recognized their face. That's how clear the water was. It wasn't choppy or cloudy, it was a normal day, otherwise. So do we think 60-foot long sea snakes exist? Who's to say? I mean, considering this list, I'd say yeah. We barely explored our own ocean. And finally, number 1, the Milky Sea Phenomenon. This one you can see from space, so we're leaving the biggest and brightest for last, folks. The Milky Sea Phenomenon was first observed back in 1864 by Captain Raphael Semmes. Captain Raphael Semmes journaled it aboard his CSS Alabama. He wrote about passing from the deep blue waters into a patch of water so bright that it startled him. The whole face of nature seemed to change, and with a little stretch of imagination, the Alabama might have been conceived to be a phantom ship lighted up by the sickly seemingly an unearthly glare of a phantom sea. That's not an exaggeration as well. This phenomena is something out of Avatar, really. It's so alien-like. Bioluminescence is part of the reason for this ghostly bright blue appearance, but sailors say there is something sinister about it as well. To this day, we don't fully understand how bioluminescence works, but it's continuing to blow our minds. For example, we just discovered a new shark. We just found a glowing shark. A glowing shark, what is happening here? The Milky Sea Phenomenon is bigger than a glowy shark, and it can span around 100,000 square miles, so you'll see it. If it's around, you'll probably see it. It lasts for a few nights too, so I don't blame these sailors for getting spooked out. In 2005, we got low orbit satellites to snap a pic of this phenomenon, but even so, we don't fully understand why it happens. But we're trying our best.
Starting us off at number 10, we have the final resting place. When it comes to Titanic related hauntings, it should come as no big surprise that the actual site where the tragedy occurred is considered one of the most haunted spots of all. According to those who have visited since the fateful day, strange sights such as odd glowing orbs of light can be seen floating around at night, and many believe they are actually the spirits of those who died at sea. But that's not all. Deep sea vessels that have explored the area near the sinking have reported to receive eerie, faint SOS calls that fade in and out, and seem to have no traceable source. Could they be the ghosts of the fallen crying out for help? Many definitely believe so. Now, orbs of light and radio static are nowhere near unheard of when it comes to suspected paranormal activity, especially when you're dealing with a place such as this, where so many people have perished. However, the most terrifying curse of all has to do with an old legend that says if you aren't careful, the lonely ghosts in the sea may just pull you overboard to live the rest of eternity with them. So just be safe if you are sailing in the area.